So up next is Alex Petros, and he's an HTMX maintainer and an aspiring HTML standards contributor. So at some point, we may have a person on the inside. He is a writer and a speaker. This is his second time on the HTMX Conf, or the Big Sky Dev Conf stage. So this is his second time up here. He has worked at both Amazon and the Washington Post, and he is here to ask and hopefully answer what is left for front-end engineers. Please welcome Alex Petros.
Thank you. Right. That was a great introduction. I don't have much to add to that. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm one of the core maintainers for the HTMX JavaScript library. And you can find me online at alexanderpetros.com or my blog, unplannedobsolescence.com, which develops a lot of these ideas before they make it to talks. So this is my second time speaking at Big Sky DevCon. It's an honor to be back here. It's the only developer conference where you can find both hypermedia legend Mike Amundsen and a potato gun that doesn't work. Last year, I gave a talk called The Life and Death of HTMX. And the premise of that talk was that HTMX advanced the field of hypermedia in a couple important ways. And we should take those things and add them to the HTML standard. And three things in particular. Forms should be able to do put, patch, and delete methods in addition to get and post. Buttons should be able to make HTTP requests the same way that forms do without needing to be wrapped in a form. And responses should be able to target any part of the page, not just trigger a page navigation. That's HTMX in a nutshell. It does other things, but those are the important ones, and those are the ones I think could be relatively easily added to the HTML standard. And long story short, a lot has happened in a year, but we're doing it. Carson and I wrote a set of proposals. They're not all done. These things take a while. But we have a proposal that describes how these things would work in HTML. And I've also gone ahead and written the actual standards proposals where you go and edit the HTML standard or the fetch standard to describe in very, very precise browser-level detail how these things would work. And if you're wondering what kind of task it is to edit the HTML standard, well, what I'll say is that if you print it out on standard paper, it's 1,000 pages long. And the relevant section for form navigation, which is section 7.4, starts with the sentence, "Welcome to the Dragon's Maw." That is a real line from the HTML standard. So it's hard work, it's slow work, but we are making progress on it, and hopefully I can come back next year and say that we have a prototype and it's in some of the browsers. But in the meantime, I want to fast forward a bit and ask the question, what if hypermedia wins? And I put wins in scare quotes here because there is no winning on the web. There has never been a platform that you less needed to win. As long as your server expresses HTML and some JavaScript and some CSS, you did it. You can do whatever the heck you like. It is the most diverse computation platform that has ever existed. But, so when you win, it really doesn't need to win for anyone else but you, or perhaps your startup, or your organization, or the people who employ you. So what does it look like if it wins for you? And we have some examples of that, in part thanks to the best one is this fellow David Guillot, who gave a talk at DjangoCon in 2022, basically said, we did it and it works. Other people have done it since, I've done this, but I still think David is the one who best explained what impacts this had on his product, and more importantly, his team. And in particular, he describes that prior to this migration, the team had 4 developers, 1 front-end developer, 2 back-end developers, and a full-stack developer. And then, to some chuckles in the audience, he says, well, when we did this migration, the back-end developer, or the front-end developer left, because we just didn't need him anymore. But the other 2 developers, who were previously back-end-only developers, became full-stack developers. So the team went from 4 people with various specialized skill sets to 3 people who could contribute across the stack. And that was all that was needed. Which brings us to the title of this talk, which is, What's Left for Front-End Engineers? In a world where hypermedia, or HTMX thought, or returning things as HTML has become the dominant way that you do things in your platform, what does that mean for front-end engineers? And I have a couple thoughts about that. So, very quick recap. I know most people here at Big Sky DevCon know what HTMX is, but HTMX adds a couple attributes to HTML so that instead of doing a full page navigation when you do an action, you can have it insert into some subset of the page. So this does get requests to users, and it returns whatever the server responded with. It replaces the button with that HTML. We can also imagine a Triptych version of this, which looks a little bit more HTML-y. It borrows the exact same language from the forms. And it says, OK, we're going to do a GET request at users, and it will replace the button with whatever the server responds. So exact same thing, just slightly different semantics. And the effect of this on your application is that you go from having a server that returns JSON APIs, so we all know what a JSON API is, to an HTML API, which is the same exact thing. If you look at it, it's a little weird at first, because you're like, that's not what I'm used to seeing come from the server, but it also encodes more information. So they both have data, they're both data formats. So yes, if you have to know where to look, but you can query this and say, what is the start time of the HTML? Oh, it's Friday 8/1. In the same way, you can ask, what is the start time of the JSON? You have to know where to look. It's in the table. But that was true of the JSON before. If you didn't know what the JSON response was going to be, then you also wouldn't know where to look for that data. So they both accomplish the same thing from a data perspective. But what HTML APIs do that JSON doesn't is they also encode behavior. So in addition to saying, in this example, very trivial bank account example, in addition to the data saying, oh, in the data list, my account number is 12345, my balance is $100, I also have a set of actions that I can take that would affect that data. So in this case, I can go to hyperlinks, I can go to pages that allow me to make deposits, withdrawals, or transfers. This is REST, by the way. We don't need to belabor the whole what is REST debate, but data and actions that you can take on that data. Each API response is a snapshot in time of what your state is on the server and what actions you might be allowed to take that would change that state. So the front-end engineer's job in a world where hypermedia, quote unquote, wins, is to take that theory, to take that understanding of what the browser does, what the server does in relation to the browser, and put it to work, put it into practice. And I think there's three basic tasks here. The first one is to build the structure, so adding hypermedia to your server and making it easy to build those kinds of HTML endpoints. Then writing new HTML elements to fill gaps in functionality that HTML is incapable of doing today. And then finally, to be the general purpose browser expert. Browsers are very complicated. There's a lot of nuance to how you might solve solutions in them. So being the go-to person, the specialist for those problems when they arise in your application. So start with the first one, which is build the structure. This is the example, bank account example from earlier. And this is not source code. Presumably, your bank account serves more than one customer. So the source code doesn't say Alex's bank account. It fills that in dynamically based on the person who's logged into the application. So this is source code. I didn't put it in French because I don't speak French. But this is using the Django templating language, sorry, not Jinja, and very, very straightforward. Account.firstname's bank account, account.number, account.balance. So you're filling in key value pairs. You're filling in those values into the template, and then that template gets sent to the front end. And there are template engines in basically every language. This is a bunch of the popular ones. But these things are a dime a dozen, and depending on the flavor of syntax that you prefer, how it integrates with your language, there are always ways to do that basic thing, which is take dictionaries, objects, whatever you want to call them, and fill out templates using the values that are associated with those objects. And every web page has a pretty basic structure to it. So there's a head and a body, and that head has certain things in it, like a title, various meta tags that influence the way the page operates, and then a style sheet, scripts, things like that. That all goes in the head. And usually those things are common between different pages. So if I am using HTMX in my application, I can load it once at the very beginning, and then make sure that the browser cache settings are such that every single other page that uses HTMX just uses the browser's cached version. Ditto with style sheets, things like images, things like that. And then obviously there's the body content. That usually varies by page, but the nav might not. A lot of web pages, might say home, about, blog, whatever, and that is common across multiple pages. So that's something that you might repeat on many pages, but the main content might be different. And there's a couple ways to do this using a template engine. One is a slightly more functional way of doing it, where the top code example I have here is basically a fragment of code that goes in every page. And then the bottom example might be the home page, where I just include it. I include the same site head every time. It's this little snippet, uses HTMX, it has a favicon, it has a viewport tag. and then there's the content of the page. So this is like one structure that's just, take that thing, include it in here. Big Sky DevCon is one of the last safe havens for object-oriented programming. So you can do it in a slightly more object-oriented fashion as well. You can define a base template, and then you can have your homepage and every other page extend that base template. So this is, you can make a slot for head, and then the index.njk here says inside block head, put home, and we're just extending the base template. Both of these work. I've done it both ways. Usually when I do it one way, I wish I'd done it the other, but the distinction is really trivial. At this point, if you introduce this to your workplace, you will probably have a coworker ask you, hey, isn't this just doing Ruby on Rails, Spring Boot, MVC, Django, vanilla PHP? And you get to turn to them and say, yes, correct. Because if anybody has been doing the web long enough, at some point, they were chugging along happily as full-stack developers, and then somebody came to them and said, sorry, we don't do it that way anymore. I'll handle the front end, you give me some JSON, and I'm going to install a mountain of JavaScript, and don't worry about it. It's all going to be better now. And that was wrong. So you get to deliver the good news and say, hey, listen, we're going to go do it the way that you already know how to do it, and those skills that you have are valuable. You've been told for a while they're not. Yes, they are. This is very, very straightforward to do. And a lot of people kind of chafe at the idea that we're going back to something that we used to do before, but if you wrote a web server in PHP that returns HTML in 2005, and you did that in 2015, and you did that in 2025, it would work great today, about just as well as it did back then. So hypermedia is kind of the base layer of stuff that you might do on the web. That is always going to be true. There's never going to be a different base layer. So you can be pretty confident that you're building on a foundation that lasts. Now, these are very, very basic HTML elements, but we may want to do something that isn't in HTML. Lots of things aren't in HTML. So the second task of the front-end developer is to extend HTML. And to explain what I mean by that, I'm going to use one of my favorite new HTML elements, which is the details element. And the details element is what we might have called an accordion or a collapsible in the past. Robbie's talk explained this. But all it does is show you some details. So you can click it to open it, you can click it to close it, click it to open it, click it to close it. And the HTML for this is extremely straightforward. It has no fluff. It says, this is a details element, and the summary text, the part that's going to display when it's closed, that goes in the summary tag. Everything else goes below the summary tag. This is very, very easy to understand. There is no implementation whatsoever. And if I'm a more traditionally back-end developer and I want to alter this, I want to say, oh, I want to add a new paragraph inside the thing that gets expanded. That's completely trivial to do because I can see where it is. I can see how that relates to the thing that I'm building. And it's also important to understand that the details element, in a sense, has some kind of local state. Because if I click to open, I click to close, I click to open, there's a state associated with whether or not this element is open. But the server doesn't care about that. There's no need to transfer that information back. That can be entirely disposable. The server does have some control over it. If it wants to say, have the thing start opened, you can just add this open attribute to the details element. But overall, the fact that there is a front-end state associated with this thing is basically irrelevant to the vast, vast majority of the time you're going to make changes to it. So my friend Denise, who's also an HTMX maintainer, once told me that I want to be a front-end developer in the alternate universe where HTMX has taken over and just write web components and CSS all day. And that's basically what a front-end developer should be the expert in. So Adam nicely teed me up here with how would you do hyperview, but in the web's hypertext. And I have this kind of trivial example, except that I did do exactly this for a client at one point. And so I have this table which says who's comfortable riding various carnival rides. And I am scared, so I'm not comfortable riding the roller coaster. But these things are editable. So it's basically an editable table. I didn't style it so that you can see, it looks like HTML, you can see the editable parts. But basically, this is showing some data in the RESTful style. I make the request to the web page. I see the current value of all these things. And if I want to change them, I can edit the select, and then I can click Save. And so yes, no, maybe are the three options here. And if you zoom in on one of these, if you wrote this in just bare bones HTML, then you might say, okay, I got to name each of these things so they have a different value in the form. But I also have 3 options associated with each one, and because no is the one that is the current value on the server at this point in time, I'm going to return that with option selected, so that when it renders to the user, it shows that currently Alex does not want to ride the roller coaster. But I think scaling problems of HTML are somewhat overstated, but this does not scale well at all, because I am repeating the same information for every single person that I have in this row. And I did this in a table that ultimately had about 35 columns and lots and lots of users, to the point where we got to like 15, 20, 25,000 users, which was something along the lines of like 75,000 lines of HTML. So that's a lot to be repeating yes, no, maybe every single time. And we can make that a lot simpler. We can make a custom element that's basically an editable entry in this table and encode none of the implementation information, but just the details that are relevant to expressing the state of the server at this point in time. So I called it edit cell, which is not a great name, but it'll get the job done. And we can create a name that is associated with that particular value: Alex carousel, Alex roller, for is he going to ride the roller coaster, and then the current value of that state, yes or no. Yeah, so you zoom in and you can see this does scale a lot better, because now what was previously 5 lines of HTML can just be 1 line of HTML. And to go back to the template engine concept from earlier, this is something that can be expressed really easily through what is essentially a for loop in your template engine. So if I have thousands of people, thousands of rows in this table, I can say for each row, the structure is very, very trivial to emulate. So person.name is the thing that goes in the first column of the table of that particular row. And then I dynamically generate whether or not they are comfortable with each particular ride. That second thing should say person.name. But person.name carousel, person.name roller, and then the value, which is the current state of whether or not that particular person wants to do those actions. And the web component aspect of this, the part where I actually wrote front-end code, is completely trivial. All it does is you extend the HTML element class in your JavaScript, and you write connected callback, which is the constructor, and I get the attribute of the value, and I get the attribute of the name, and then I just create HTML that will give me the selected value depending on what the value that was passed to my custom element was. So this is very, very easy to do, and there's no shadow DOMs here. There's really nothing complicated. All it is a little bit of JavaScript that edits the custom element to make it an HTML element. And this is something that's, sure, it's a front-end specialty, but it's also not that hard. So I've been starting to write web components in basically this way, just like writing 5, 10-line web components to solve problems like this. And just a couple hot tips so you don't make the same mistakes I did. Always load them with script type equals module, or defer also works too. But basically all this does is it makes sure that by the time you run your connected callback, the DOM has already loaded. So type equals module scripts run after the DOM has been parsed, so that you can do things like edit the children of the HTML element, of the custom element. Connected callback is like a constructor, except it runs when it's added to the DOM. So this lets you do things like create a new custom element in JavaScript and then add attributes to it. And all of the constructing stuff won't happen until you're good and ready and you say, okay, go to the DOM, then the connected callback will come. And then just remember that both attributes and children are part of the interface. This is an example that I stole from Eric Meyer, who wrote one of the blog posts that influenced this general concept called Blinded by the Light DOM. And basically what he does is he says, hey, I have this super slider which can edit the font on a page, but I can still change the label, I can still change the input, and so I have some control over how these elements are expressed, how these elements are customized, but it will still do all of the advanced things that I wanted to do. I kind of didn't realize why this was so important until I actually tried to do something like this at work. And it's important because remember that the template, the actual HTML, is the thing that all of your coworkers are going to be editing. So the more you can, and this is true for things like translation, internationalization, but also for
Thank you, John.
We will fix that in post. So anyway, the element is something that the HTML, the custom HTML that you've written, that's the part that's going to be owned by the whole team. You may be the specialist in tweaking how the functionality of the custom element works, but the anything that can be expressed via attributes and via the children of that element are things that can be owned by the entire team. And just as like a thought exercise, if you wanted to add a new ride to this table, it's very, very easy to pattern match on how that works. I think that's something that came up in Mike's talk earlier, but you're really trying to create obvious patterns that can evolve even after the person who built it isn't there or has handed this off or isn't around to think about how to extend this thing. It should be sort of self-evident how to extend it. In this case, if you wanted to add a new ride, you would just add another column to the table, and you would add a new data field that is associated with that particular ride. So one way to be a 10x engineer is to make your 5 colleagues each 2 times more efficient. So if there used to be a whole chunk of the application that your colleague said, hey, after the JSON, that is not my problem. If it's now, there's a much bigger section of it that everybody is comfortable editing, then everybody is more productive and people can go on vacation and things are fine. So finally, and this is just essentially disconnected thoughts about what a front-end engineer thinks about, but be the expert in the browser, be the person who understands the computation model and is able to solve problems using features that people who don't spend all day in the browser might not know about. So that means things that make HTML work correctly. If you don't add meta equals charset UTF-8, emojis won't display. I've lost hours of my life to debugging why emojis don't display. Just add the meta tag, know that that's the problem, and when somebody says, hey, I had smart quotes, but there's no smart quotes, meta charset UTF-8. Same with the viewport. For whatever reason, mobile web browsers will not properly display the web page unless you add this viewport tag that tells them how to scale it. Okay, you're the person who knows that. You've dealt with this before. That's what a front-end engineer is around for. And then always ask, could this JavaScript be HTML? If I was forms and buttons, even in their current incarnation, can go a very long way. I already talked about details. Dialog element is another one. Modals are now just handled natively by the browser. And yeah, just go watch Robbie Wagner's talk from a little while ago. He broke this down. All of the JavaScript libraries you no longer need because they're in the web platform now. Also, could this JavaScript be CSS? CSS is very, very capable. And if you can express something like an animation or some kind of interactivity via CSS, you definitely should because it's declarative and it lasts forever. So special shout out at the bottom in particular to grid layout. The number of divs I have deleted from my HTML because grid layout just says, put it here, put it here, put it here, put it here, is astounding. But if you get good at grid layout, you basically never need to write a div again. And then performance optimization, so knowing about how cache control headers work, know how to do image sizing properly, know how to not have large assets block your page load. These are all things that are very, very browser specific, but they're very important to the performance of your application. Know how to use a screen reader. This is something that came up for me recently. They're not hard, they're there, but you are the person who is responsible for the interactivity of your page, and that means interactivity in all of the different ways someone might use your web application. So you should be the go-to person for not just fixing accessibility issues, but being aware in the first place that there are multiple, the point in many ways of hypermedia is that it can be expressed in a way that meets the user's preferences. And finally, but definitely not least, understand the security model. So if the browser has very specific security concerns, and making sure that the application that you've set up and the kind of the engines that you've made to make this easier for everybody to do are conformant to the various the security concerns that exist in the browser. These are a couple that I always highlight that are kind of basics to putting user-generated content on the web with template engines. So if after all of that, there's absolutely nothing left to do, well then, check in with your back-end colleagues. Maybe it's time to learn some Java. Thank you very much.
Well done. Man, talk about being cool under pressure.
Oh, I appreciate it.
You just went with it. Great job.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron.
You mentioned in there talking about Ruby on Rails, PHP, simplicity.
Sure.
Do you feel like the industry on the front end is swinging back towards simplicity, or is this aspirational at this point?
I mean, I wouldn't be here if that weren't true to
Okay.
some extent. A lot of the energy around HTMX, a lot of the energy around hyperview, hypermedia, is because I think people are reacting to realizing that they don't need a lot of that stuff. And in many cases, some of that stuff did used to be needed. The browser has improved a lot. A lot of the open UI stuff has made it really, really easy to describe what we now understand as common web patterns in just pure HTML. So it's not necessarily that doing some of these things was wrong 10 years ago. Some of them were definitely wrong, but some of them were also necessary. It's now just a matter of doing some education and explaining that it is now possible to raise the floor of interactivity. And as long as you're operating at that floor, you're operating at a level of abstraction that is not going to go away as long as the web exists.
And what is the process of becoming an HTML contributor? I don't even know what that looks like. What's the body, and how do you get into that sacred group?
There's a GitHub repo.
That's it.
You submit it. It's like anything else. You submit a pull request, and you just make sure that you've done your homework. So browsers are very, very conservative, and this is one of the best things about the web. There's essentially never going to be a case in which you write some valid HTML, and then 10 years from now, your web page doesn't work. So that's what makes the distributed nature of it possible. But it also means it's really, really, really hard to get changes. So if you do want to add something to HTML, there are standards groups that you can join. There are working groups where you can kind of get your feet wet. But at the end of the day, you have to have an idea. You have to make sure that you know all of the possible concerns with that idea. You have to do the research to see if anybody else has tried to do this, what their concerns were, and then just write a ton of really, really specific documentation of what you want to do and why, and take it to the standards people and open a pull request.
That's easier than I expected. Y'all give it up for Alex.
Thank you very much.